Welcome to our podcast series on diversity and inclusion, brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading independent professional body dedicated to promoting best practice and raising the standards of coaching worldwide. I'm Dr. Alexandra Morgan, Senior Lecturer and Coach Educator. In this series, we're privileged to be talking to a superb range of coaches and consultants whose work is making a significant contribution to advancing diversity and inclusion in society and in the coaching profession. We hope this series sparks curiosity and encourages change. Hello, everybody. I'm Alex Morgan, your host for this Association for Coaching podcast on diversity and inclusion. With me today, I have Nick Basannavar, Head of Consulting at Included and also Associate Fellow at Birkbeck, working on the Welcome Project on sexual violence. So, Nick, welcome.
Alex, great to be with you. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, Nick, can you tell me a bit about yourself? Tell us about your role at Included, or also a little bit maybe about your role as a researcher and anything else about your background that you'd like to share with us.
Absolutely, Alex. Thank you. And you mentioned, I guess, the two sort of areas of my life that take up most of my time in terms of work anyway. One is as head of consulting at Included, which is a diversity and inclusion consultancy based in the UK, but operating globally. And I'm also, as you say, a historian and researcher working on sexual violence and how it's being represented, particularly in the UK, in political spheres, in the media, and in professional discourse since the 1960s. And maybe to explain, I guess, how I got to today, I might go back to the beginning, if that's all right, and talk a bit about my background.
Please, yeah.
So I grew up, I was born in London, grew up in a dual heritage family. So my father came from South India, near a city, Bangalore. My mum was from a Irish Catholic family in London. I've sort of been thinking a bit about how I ended up in the professions that I have, and it sort of makes sense to me now. I think I had a childhood that was quite confusing in some ways. Being dual heritage, it's often a common theme that dual heritage kids in the UK grow up wondering, where do I fall? A bit here, but not here, and a little bit there. And that's always been a big part of my life and my sort of identity. And I think ties really closely to the work on inclusion that I now do. My dad had an interesting background. So he was the youngest of 9 in India, and I'm the youngest child as well. So when I was born, my dad was in his 60s. When he was born, his dad was in his 60s. So recent family history has determined that my grandfather was born in the 1860s in India, which
Wow.
which has made me think a lot about family identity, race, ethnicity, and culture, and so on. So I think those have always been questions at my core. And my dad passed away when I was 13, and so sort of I've had a quest to almost fill in those gaps. And my work really helps me do that. So my work both as a researcher on childhood, but also my professional work on diversity and inclusion. So I guess that's sort of a roundabout way how I came to the work. Would it be helpful to tell you a bit about Included and what we do as well?
Yes, please. Tell us more about Included, and interested in the kind of work you do and how you do it.
Absolutely, thank you. So Included is a diversity and inclusion consultancy. Maybe I start a bit with the history and where we came from. We were founded by a chap called Stephen Frost, who's still our CEO today. Stephen was the head of diversity and inclusion at the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. He was the first person to fulfill that role at a Games. And afterwards, he really wanted to ensure that the legacy was maintained and more than maintained, actually replicated in different contexts around the world. And so that was sort of the inspiration and the genesis of Frost Included, as it was then. We've since defrosted and removed his name from the business, and we're now Included. But yes, over the last decade, we've been working really hard to build inclusive organizations in different geographies, different sectors, and different contexts. And at the moment, we're a team headquartered in the UK of 14. A growing team where we were 4 last year. We're 14 now. I think a reflection of events to some degree in the world when we think about the pandemic, when we think about the acceleration of social movements like Black Lives Matter following the murder of George Floyd. People are engaging with diversity and inclusion in a way that I think they haven't before. And we're sort of at the vanguard of that. And how do we meet the challenges of our clients? And I can talk a bit about that down the track. But that's sort of where we came from and who we are.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for listeners to know. And you're right, the moment is now, isn't it, for diversity and inclusion, and for companies like yourself that help other organisations do that. So I know that you work with a particular model to help your clients understand what's required to really embed D&I within an organisation. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So I think, really important to acknowledge, I suppose, where we are. When we think about polarization in the world, politically, socially, economically, we think about the pandemic and the effects that's had. I mentioned the acceleration of social movements. There's a lot going on, right? And I think the first thing to say is that this is a topic that's imperative now for many organizations, for many people, in a way that I don't think it was even 3 years ago. And with that in mind, I guess, as you say, I'll talk about our model, which is really looking at how people and organizations engage with diversity and inclusion. So in a way, it's a maturity model, really. And the first sort of thing to talk about is legal and compliance, right? This is what we call Diversity 101, which is organizations really engaging with D&I, or I should say on terms. Diversity and inclusion is what we're talking about so far. But of course, there are other terms here. Equality, equity, belonging are also terms that listeners may have heard. And in our organisation, we talk about diversity and inclusion as an umbrella for all of these.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful, because those other words, particularly belonging and enabling people to get a sense of belonging, that is a very emotive part of D&I, isn't it? That's the sort of the real nuts and bolts level of how it actually feels, to be included or not, as the case may be. So thank you for bringing those other words in. I think they're really important. So you were talking about legal and compliance. That is like the sort of first layer of your model. Would it be too cynical for me to say, is that all about ticking the right boxes, or is it more than that?
Yes and no would be my diplomatic answer. So I think, yeah, absolutely. The cynical hat would say some organizations approach D&I essentially from the standpoint of, let's not get sued here. Let's do the legalities that we need to. And in the UK, that transpires in very important things like gender pay gap reporting for organizations of more than 250 people, I think it is. Of course, we have the Equality Act 2010, which says that you can't discriminate against certain protected characteristics. And actually, what I should say with this maturity model is it's not one or the other. You need them all. So you need to have the legal foundations in place to address, of course you do. We don't want to break the law. So my answer, I guess, to your question would be, you need it, but it's not enough. It's insufficient. And so that leads us, I guess, to the second step, the second foundation, which is what we call Diversity 2.0 in Included. And that's more moving from legal and compliance towards reputation and the way that organizations really show up in the world. I can give you a couple of examples of that. There's some really good stuff that happens in here around organizational activism. So perhaps listeners are working for organizations that really engage in Pride Month, for instance. At the moment in the UK, we're celebrating Black History Month, and more organizations are visible on those topics, which is great and important. Within organizations, Diversity 2.0 might mean things like employee resource groups or network groups, which perhaps some listeners are members of, which tend to be around issues such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and so on, and to help promote the interests of those communities within organizations. To again turn the slightly cynical switch, I think some organizations have been quite vocal on platforms like social media, through other channels as well. But actually, and particularly if we think back to last summer, around the time of the murder of George Floyd, you may remember things like Blackout Tuesday, where organizations replaced their Instagram image with a black image. But actually, when you sort of peel back the visuals, there's not that much substance, or actually the action isn't backing up the image. And so that has been the case if we were to look with a little bit more of a critical eye, naming no names, but across different sectors. And so again, 2.0, like 101, is important but insufficient. And so that takes us to what we call Inclusion 3.0, which is really the space we like to work in with our clients, which is how do you really embed inclusion, to reframe it, reposition it as an imperative for your organization, not as just something you do because you have to for legal reasons, or because you want to look good to your shareholders or your customer base, but actually because you really care about it and because you can see that inclusion provides benefits above and beyond simply diversity statistics. And so for us, that's really what we mean by sort of strategic embedded inclusion. And that's really hard work. It takes the work not just of an HR team or a diversity and inclusion professional, but actually the whole organization working together to really reframe the issue and rethink it. And so that's the space we're in.
So how do you help an organization achieve this strategic embedded inclusion? Can you give us some examples of maybe organizations you've worked with and what kind of work you did with them, and the key areas of activity that you get involved with as well? Because earlier you mentioned data, for example, and I know data is hugely important to what you do. But if you can give us an example of an organization that you've worked with and exactly what you help them with, I think that would be brilliant. It would help listeners really see how you make inclusion, as you say, really strategically embedded in an organization.
Absolutely. So maybe I can start by pointing towards the areas of activity that we generally engage in, and I can give some examples based on that. So there are 5 things. We call these 5 things the key pillars of an inclusive organization, and we consider them to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So you need to have all of them working in tandem to really build the inclusive organization. You can't have one and not the others. And let me explain what they are. So the first of those is strategy. And this is about really tying diversity and inclusion to your overall organizational purpose, goals, and vision. And that can be quite a profound reframing for a lot of organizations, actually. An example here might be, let's take organizations in medical research. So we've done quite a lot of work with Wellcome, which is one of the world's largest philanthropic organizations, and they fund medical research into various different diseases. But Wellcome, the strategy piece for them was thinking about D&I not just as an issue for their workforce of 1,000 people sitting on the Euston Road in London and dotted around other parts of the UK, but actually about inclusion as an enabler of their research. So actually, unless we think about diversity and inclusion in things like research on cardiology, we're never going to get better outcomes and impact for women who disproportionately have suffered more from certain heart diseases than men, for example. So actually, strategy there is about how it becomes an enabler of what you do and not a different work stream. So that would be one example. Another would be work that we've been doing with a few different organizations on climate change. I know that the Association for Coaching is thinking about this topic a lot at the moment. And there it's actually acknowledging that climate change isn't equal. Climate change actually affects different groups far more profoundly than it does others. So the global poor south, in inverted commas, suffer profoundly more than do the global north. And so actually climate change and social inclusion are really profoundly tied together. So how do we think about embedding that in our strategy? So that would be the first piece, which is on strategy.
I was just reflecting that, it's much wider than I imagined it to be. I thought you were going to tell me about HR strategy. But as you said, it's actually a whole new strategy organizational wide, including product development, sales and marketing approaches, and presumably, business operations and all sorts. So it's really kind of having it through the whole DNA of the organization.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, Alex. Exactly. Because I think if you treat diversity and inclusion, as many organizations have done, as an HR issue, I think you're missing a massive trick. And in fact, missing really the point. Of course, HR is massively critical and important to enabling a successful D&I strategy and about making sure people do feel included and feel belonging. But it's not the whole picture. So I think, a very good observation. And I think it goes hand in hand with the second piece, which is data or evidence. This is really understanding what kind of organization we are in terms of who is in our organization. So we do a lot of work on measuring the diversity of different organizations. A lot of our clients didn't know how to do that. How do we know who we have? How do we know what questions we can ask? That differs according to laws in France, Germany, the UK, the US. So we help organizations to work out, first of all, as a baseline, who are we? And split that according to different characteristics, whether that's gender, sexual orientation, race, and so on. But then the piece that organizations often miss is, okay, we kind of know who we are in terms of our diversity, But how inclusive are we is a question that's not very well answered. And that's one of our major work streams as well. We help companies to measure inclusion quantitatively, and we've been doing that now for 5 or 6 years with a model that we've developed. And this kind of diagnostic really helps organizations to understand where they are in terms of topics like microaggressions, like transparency in pay and in performance, in topics like psychological safety, which our research tells us is one of the most critical determinants of an inclusive culture. And, listeners may have been involved in engagement surveys in organizations which ask questions to employees like, do you feel this is an inclusive organization, ranked 1 to 5? Our approach is a little bit different, and actually we try to make it more experiential. So rather than a question like, how inclusive do you feel your boss or your company is, we ask people, how often are you interrupted in meetings?
Okay, interesting. Yep.
Or are your ideas often attributed to somebody else? Because that really helps us get down to experience and evidence, and helps us to then target interventions in a more helpful way. So I guess in short, on data, yes, it's diversity, but it's also inclusion. It's now, but it's also the future. So we work to project based on current hiring and retention trends what an organization might look like in 3, 5, 7 years. And then again to course correct if needed.
I like the way that you're measuring both, the baseline data in terms of who is represented within the organisation, but also the behaviours. I've not seen that before. I think that's absolutely great. Those behaviours that make people feel included or not, that they belong or not, that they have a voice or not. It's fantastic that you're trying and succeeding, by the sounds of it, in terms of being able to measure those and report back to organisations on those behaviours.
Yeah, thank you. And what's interesting now is, now that we have 5 years of data on this, we're able to aggregate and see trends within sectors, within geographies. And actually, interestingly, colleagues are now working on pre-COVID and post-COVID, and to see how, has the change in working conditions that most organizations have experienced actually changed the way people perceive inclusion. And we're hoping to write up some of that research in the coming months. So watch this space.
Oh yeah, I look forward to that. Excellent. Okay, so we were talking about strategy, then we were talking about data. I believe there's 5. I think you said there's 5 key areas of activity. So strategy, data, and what's next? So
3 and 4 then are connected but distinct, and they're governance and leadership. So let me talk a little about those, if that's okay. So governance is a simple question, but a difficult answer. The simple question is, who is accountable for diversity and inclusion in one's organization, in one's context? And we work with companies of all sorts, with boards, with execs, to help them really answer that question in a good way. Often we hear, well, it's everybody's responsibility. Okay, but what does that look like, and how does that map to activities and actions and actual impact? So yeah, we consult on that quite difficult but important question. The 4th area, leadership, is really thinking about how we can affect positive cultural change to help leaders really drive inclusive cultures on an individual and on a collective level. Often this is some of our most impactful work, we find. The reason it's impactful and important is because leaders have such an outsized effect how organizations behave and perform. People mimic leaders, and leaders often don't realize their own power and influence. And that's why it can be incredibly damaging on the negative side when a very visible leader simply delegates diversity and inclusion to someone who has less power. And by the way, that person is very often from a minority group and in a less influential role, often within HR or a diversity and inclusion team. Often that person is the sole minority in the room. So I guess the first point is to really, I can't overstate enough the importance of leadership involvement and in building an inclusive culture. And I wonder if it'd be helpful to talk through a little bit about how we actually work with leaders, and give a couple of examples if that's useful.
That would be hugely useful. Yes, please, Nick.
Sure. So I guess it's kind of a 3-step model we use. Sorry to introduce another model. We've had the maturity model and then the 5 things and now another, but hopefully listeners are bearing with me. But the approach we use with leaders is understand, lead and deliver. So simply, understand is really helping leaders to understand intellectually what's at stake here. What is diversity and inclusion? but what is it within our organizational context specifically? And why should I care about it? So that's the understand bit. And we'll normally do that with the collective group session with an executive team or a board to really help reframe inclusion. And we'll often go back to the point I was saying earlier around strategy, where, this isn't just an HR matter, but this is actually about what we do as an organization and how we can embed it. So we'll take leaders on a journey first with that understand piece, with normally in a group setting. The second then is lead, because it's not enough simply to intellectually get it. And I think the last year has shown us this, actually. A lot of people now get why D&I matters, but lead is about really drawing on leaders' intrinsic motivators to help them connect and create the energy that's required to act. So if understanding is about the intellect, you could say lead is about the heart, making it real for leaders, bringing it home and creating the motivation. And we do that through a combination of group work, but also one-to-one coaching to really help them in a kind of discovery coaching way to discover their motivations and enforce understandings. So if you've got understand, you've got lead, then the final bit is on deliver, which is let's get real and let's get practical. And the reasoning here is that a lot of D&I implementation still fails because of that practical failure, a failure to deliver on action plans. How do we move from intention to action? And that's really our brief when working with leadership groups. And the way that we help leaders deliver is, again, more coaching, one-to-one. So moving from discovery coaching to more action-based coaching to help craft action plans. And then to reconvene as a collective executive team or board or whatever it is, to commit to the plans together, and then to check in again down the track to hold ourselves accountable for progress. And this is a process we've been through with many different organisations in different settings. We've worked with the Bank of England and their leaders, which is detailed in our impact report, which you can find on our website, which I'll talk about later. With Welcome, who I've mentioned already, with organisations like Cloudflare, which is a major tech organisation, following this understand, lead, deliver process. And the last thing I'd say on leadership there is that this isn't a one-off kind of big bang intervention. We know that behavioral change, habits take time to change. And so the minimum length of engagement we would have with a group like that is 3 months to really do things little and often, rather than, as I say, as a big bang, because one-off touch points don't work. They're ineffective.
Excellent. Thank you. I'd love to come back to the leadership development and coaching side a little bit later on in our conversation, if that's okay, because I know, the audience for this podcast, the vast majority of people listening are going to be coaches or people who purchase coaching for organizations. So for the listener, it would be great if we can carry on fleshing out your models, because although you apologize for having models, I think they're actually hugely useful, because they enable people to be able to really picture what you do and why you do it and how you do it. Earlier, we were talking about the 5 key areas of activity. And so just to remind the listeners, we talked about strategy, we talked about data, we talked about governance. Just then we were talking about leadership. But there's a 5th, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, can you tell us about that?
And the 5th is systems, often tagged as processes, but we tend to go with systems. And this is really the things that make up an organization, the activities that make up an organization, whether it's talent systems and processes like recruitment and performance management and so on, whether it's actually processes like marketing or like procurement or even like product design. And we do a lot of work within these systems to help organizations to de-bias them in order to create more inclusive impact and outcomes. And I can give you some examples there. Let's take recruitment, which is often one of the first places that organizations go when they think about creating a diverse workplace. But actually, let's break that down and think about what's involved there. So we work with organizations to really think about where they are advertising. So let's think about attraction. Let's look at, if you're an educational institution, as we work with a lot of those, are you hiring your teachers or lecturers or professors solely in the Times Higher Education Supplement, as many do? Or actually, are we thinking a bit differently about where we might hire? Who reads that supplement, right? Let's think about the audience of the spaces in which we advertise. But then also not just attraction, but how is the individual or the candidate engaging with you when they go through the recruitment process? If they're coming in for an interview, what's the space like? If they're answering interview questions or case studies, are the case studies ones which would be familiar to people from different backgrounds? It's things like this. If you're interviewing a woman for a role, who's on the panel? Is it 3 men? What does that say about your recruitment process? So we really get into detail. We've even gone to the detail of applying for a job ourselves, which is detailed again in our impact report with a company called Alex Partners, which is a global consulting organization. By the way, we were hired, not that we were allowed to take up the post, but we actually went through the process ourselves to really understand, what might be the areas of
That's
bias.
very good.
And so we do a lot of work in that recruitment space. But also when we think about systems, it's talent, and that's massively important. It's critical. But let's think about products as well, because design of products can have catastrophic impact on inclusion. When I used to work in an unnamed previous organization, I used to go to the bathroom and use the automatic hand taps to wash my hands. Listeners can't see, but I have a slightly darker skin tone. And I would note that my time taken for the automatic hand tap to come on was slightly longer than that for white colleagues. And I wondered, why is this? And it comes down to design and testing, because the hand tap manufacturer has not been testing on darker skin tones. And of course, the output will be something like this. You can apply that to really devastating consequences as well when you think about driverless cars. There was a study done a couple of years ago by Georgia Tech University, which showed that driverless cars were bumping into black people more than white people in road testing. And again, this comes down to how we're thinking about design and testing. So, in a similar way, I suppose, to what we did with recruitment, we look at the steps involved in product design as well, in order to really make sure we're thinking about these things. So we play a role there as a challenger, as a critical friend to organizations.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, those stories that you just shared there make it come alive in the sense that, that how do we really de-bias the system and what do we really need to do about it? In a minute, I think it would be interesting to have a conversation about whether we need to de-bias coaching, but we'll come around to that.
Well, let's go there. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. But before we do that, you were sharing a couple of examples earlier. I think you mentioned the Bank of England, for example. Don't want to leave listeners hanging. I think, a little bit more information about what you actually did for a couple of organisations would be hugely helpful and interesting.
Absolutely. Let me talk a bit about the Bank of England, which hopefully most listeners will know what they do. They're the central bank in the United Kingdom. Although this was before my time, I know a little bit about the background and the project. It comes back, I think, to the strategic embedding of inclusion and really helping to craft the why. Why does this matter to us as an organisation? Well, let's take the Bank of England. Their primary KPI is risk mitigation in the UK's public finances. Nearly all of the research shows that diverse teams, well included, can help with risk mitigation. So why wouldn't we? And that was sort of the starting point for us with the bank. How can we really help to embed that point and work on that point with leaders? And the bank is a very evidence-led, data-driven organization. So for us, the data piece that I spoke about earlier was really important. So showing the bank who they are at the moment. We ran the inclusion diagnostic to show them which parts are working, which parts aren't, and then to help to target interventions. We worked with the governor at the time to play back those findings and his executive team to help them work on their individual behaviours as well through the 3-step leadership model I discussed. So if we think about the areas I spoke about, the 5 areas, we kind of went through the whole journey. Now, the bank is still on that journey, right? They've very publicly come out and said recently in a court report, I think very well laid out still some of the areas they need to work on in terms of race and ethnicity specifically. That to some might look like a negative because they're putting their failings out into the world. I think it's a big positive because what we need more of are those humble, transparent stories about what's working and what isn't. So to me, that was a really pleasing barometer, actually, of the bank's maturity on D&I. And I think they're tackling things in a really positive way. So that would be one example.
It's a really good example, and I totally agree with you about sharing your information, showing your maturity around this, because it's too easy to bury your head in the sand, isn't it, and pretend that everything is fine in your organisation, that you're doing all the right things and you're saying all the right things, but to actually be honest and say we've got work to do, I think is the best place to start, isn't it?
It can be really powerful and also helps to create the platform for change. Just another one I'd call out as well, also from the regulatory world in the UK, is Ofcom. Ofcom, which is the regulator of the UK's television, radio and communications services. About 1,000 people. We've been working with Ofcom for a few years now, and we've been working with them on their internal strategy, but also their external work. So actually just last week, Ofcom released their diversity in broadcasting 5-year report, which we supported them with, which has some really fascinating insights. I urge listeners to have a look at that. But for Ofcom, the strategic point was, okay, we've got our 900 odd people, again, in an office in Southwark, but Ofcom's purpose is to make communications work for everyone. That's their stated purpose. Well, how can you begin to make communications work for everyone without thinking about inclusion and what everyone means and the different needs of different groups? Again, for us, work with them has been about really tying diversity and inclusion to the wider purpose, as well, of course, as thinking about their internal structures and behaviours and how they do it. And I think they've done some great work, both internally and externally on D&I, much of which is on their website, if listeners would like to read more.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. So I'm coming around to let's get provocative about the coaching profession. When you were talking about recruitment and taking a systematic review of recruitment processes, I started to wonder about, large organisations that recruit coaches. They create a pool of coaches to support their leadership development programmes, for example. My guess is that those pools aren't particularly diverse. It's just a guess. But, I'm thinking of coaching pools that I've worked in, for example. I would say there weren't particularly diverse communities. How would you challenge us, Nick, in terms of debiasing the system in coaching and in the coaching profession?
Well, first of all, I guess it would be interesting for us to think about why it matters in coaching. Why does D&I matter in coaching? And I did a bit of thinking beforehand on this. I'm not a coaching expert, but I think a lot of the principles that we've applied elsewhere can be applied here. And I came up with 3 thoughts. One is that, surely the more that a coach understands the background, the lived experience, the context, the challenges of their coachee, the more effective they're going to be. Context matters, right? It's not just about,
couldn't agree more.
It's just about the specific matter or challenge at hand that a coachee is facing. So it actually comes down to me for effectiveness, really, and that links to the second point, which is that if we have an undiverse pool of coaches, our perspectives are naturally limited. I mean, how can we move forward as a profession if we can't assess risk better? If we can't come up with innovative ideas, if we can't be creative in approaches, all of these things diversity helps with. So for coaching, there must be something there about effectiveness as well. And then the third thought I had, which is connected but perhaps different, is on the specific impact for minorities. And I was thinking about ethnic minorities, but it could apply to other groups, to other minority groups, which is that minorities tend to have to play roles at work in ways that majority groups don't. We hear a lot about how Black employees, for example, have to be held or feel they're held to different standards than white colleagues at work. And I think that unhelpful paradigm is not helped by having undiverse coaching cohorts who perhaps aren't as open, or not through any intentional fault, but they don't have the same lived experience or perspective. So by diversifying our coaching cohorts, we can really help to tackle some of those specific systemic issues that minority groups face as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Nick, and that's hugely helpful insights. And it strikes me that we run the danger in the coaching profession of large organisations then subcontract the coaching and the coaching provision to another, a large coaching organisation, for example, where in there I am wondering, is the check and the balance in terms of how diverse the coaching pool is and how effective the diversity or not is for the wider organisation that they're working in. Thank you. I think the points that you've made are hugely important, and also I think it's something that we as coaches and as coaching profession we need to think about and find ways of addressing. Nick, we're beginning to run out of time. I mean, it's been a hugely fascinating conversation, and I said earlier, for you to illustrate your models and the way in which you work enables us all, as listeners to you, to really picture what you do and then think about where we ourselves, might contribute to diversity and inclusion in our own way. To wrap up, have you got any concluding thoughts that you can leave all of us with in terms of what we could do to make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it can seem daunting, right, this work, and it is difficult work. We're dealing with issues that have been intractable in some cases for centuries, and we're trying to fix something that's taken centuries to create in a year in some cases. So let's acknowledge that and be humble about that, but also be positive, because I think all coaches have a role to play here, and no matter how small, every positive step has a positive impact. So I hope I haven't daunted people, I guess, by the scope of the work here. I would say that there are lots of little things we can all do as individuals, whether it's supporting a network group in our organisation, whether it's more proactively looking for more diverse pools in our coaching pools, whether it's taking on someone from a marginalised group as a coachee. That there are smaller things we can do that I think will help add up to a really positive impact. So I guess my closing message would be, yes, let's acknowledge the challenges there are, but let's also be positive about it. I think we can make really, really great impact.
Thank you. And I would say I don't think you have daunted us, because the way that you've explained the work that your organisation does actually made it sound very accessible. If I worked for a larger organisation, it would have shifted my mind from the too hard to do pile to actually we can do something about this. And organisations like yourselves have got route maps and models we can follow and clear steps that we can take to measure where we are and to know where we're going to go to. So I think you made it actually sound very accessible. So thank you, Nick, for that.
Thank you.
So I know there's going to be people listening that would no doubt want to talk to you further. So can you tell us how we would get hold of you if we'd want to do that?
Absolutely. So, well, first things first, you can find us on our website, which is www.included.com. You can also contact me direct. So I'm on nick@included.com. That's Nick, NICK, @included.com. You can also contact my colleague Lydia, who's our wonderful marketing manager, Lydia@included.com, LYDIA.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nick, thank you so much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and look forward to working with you further in the future.
Likewise, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much.
Right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
So thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. I've been Alex Morgan. Our purpose is to inspire and champion coaching excellence to advance the coaching profession and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and in turn society. If you'd like to find out more, please follow us on LinkedIn and explore our webpage at theassociationforcoaching.com. There you can keep up to date with our latest episodes and conversations, as well as our digital learning calendar.